let's dive into something pretty heavy today, but super important. Reconciliation after genocide.
Yeah, really heavy stuff.
You gave me this article by Dr. Ervin Staub, who is a psychologist, and he's done a lot of work on this.
Yes.
Especially in Rwanda. And
a lot of it in Rwanda, yeah.
Really, really complex issue, obviously, but we're going to try to break it down and see if we can make some sense of it for everyone.
Well, one thing that's so interesting about Staub's work is he doesn't just focus on the aftermath.
Right.
He really gets into like the psychology of it.
Yeah.
Of the violence.
How it happens.
Yeah. So, imagine trying to rebuild trust in a society where the very foundation of security has been completely shattered.
Yeah.
That's what reconciliation is all about.
Yeah. So the article talks about the psychological scars of mass violence and how they impact everyone, not just the direct victims.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So how does that work?
Well, Staub really highlights how trauma can make survivors see the world, especially those outside their own group, as a constant threat.
Yeah.
Imagine living with that kind of fear where every stranger feels like a potential enemy.
Right.
That makes peaceful conflict resolution very, very difficult.
Wow. Yeah, no kidding. That paints quite a picture.
Yeah.
And it's not just the survivors, right? The perpetrators also carry psychological burden.
Oh, absolutely.
So what's going on in their minds?
Well, they grapple with the weight of their actions. And, they're often justifying them and maintaining defensiveness even after the violence is over.
Yeah.
It's a complex psychological process.
Yeah.
But, understanding it is key to really addressing the deep-rooted causes of conflict.
Okay, so they're trapped in this kind of cycle of justification and denial.
Yeah, yeah.
And what about the bystanders, the people who witness this violence but don't participate directly? Do they escape unscathed?
Unfortunately, not at all.
What happens there?
Their inaction, their silence, it can be incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
Think about it. By not intervening, they become complicit in the dehumanization of the victims.
Yeah.
In some cases, they might even end up joining the perpetrators and furthering that cycle of violence.
That's a chilling thought.
It is.
It seems like everyone involved is caught in this web of trauma and psychological scarring.
It really is a web.
So where do you even begin to untangle that?
Well, Staub argues that healing is the foundation.
Right.
For reconciliation, it's about engaging with painful experiences in a supportive environment.
Okay.
But it's not just individual therapy.
Right.
It's also about rebuilding trust within and across groups.
Yeah.
It's about acknowledging the suffering of others and really reaffirming our shared humanity.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do you rebuild trust between people who have experienced such horrific violence?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems almost impossible.
It is incredibly difficult, but Staub's work in Rwanda offers a glimmer of hope.
Okay.
He and his team brought together survivors and Hutu bystanders in these small group discussions. The survivors shared their stories, and the bystanders listened with empathy, acting as witnesses to the suffering.
So these empathic witnesses, they weren't there to judge or offer solutions, but simply to listen and bear witness to the pain.
Exactly.
How did that work?
Well, the results were remarkable.
Really?
The study found that this approach significantly reduced trauma symptoms in survivors and fostered more positive attitudes towards the other group.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a testament to the power of simply listening with empathy.
Yeah.
And acknowledging the human cost of violence.
This is where I think things get really fascinating. Dr. Staub doesn't stop at addressing the symptoms of the trauma. He argues that understanding the root causes of violence is crucial for preventing future atrocities.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
So how does that work?
Well, he uses this model called the evolution of harm doing. And it's not about excusing the violence.
Right.
But understanding the factors that made it possible. So it starts with difficult life conditions, economic hardship, political instability, things like that. All these create frustration and a sense of powerlessness.
Right. So when people feel powerless, they look for someone to blame, a scapegoat for their suffering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where dangerous ideologies come in.
Yeah.
They offer these simple explanations, identifying enemies who are supposedly responsible for all the problems.
Right.
And over time, this can lead to the dehumanization of the other group, making violence seem justified, even necessary.
So it's this gradual process where individuals and even entire societies can get pulled into this cycle of violence.
Yeah, it's a cycle.
Yeah.
And Staub emphasizes that certain cultural factors can accelerate this process.
Yeah.
A history of devaluing a particular group, unquestioning obedience to authority, a lack of tolerance for different viewpoints. These can all create this breeding ground for violence.
It's like a perfect storm of psychological and social factors. So how do you apply this understanding to real-world situations? To places like Rwanda that have experienced such horrific violence?
Well, Staub and his team went beyond individual healing in Rwanda.
Right.
They actually worked to promote broader societal changes to prevent future outbreaks of violence.
So what do those societal changes look like? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure, one of the key pillars Staub emphasizes is truth and justice.
Okay.
So establishing the truth about what happened acknowledges the suffering of the victims and reaffirms that moral order that was violated.
Right.
It's about creating a shared understanding of the past.
You can't just pretend like it didn't happen if you want to move forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then there's justice.
Okay.
It's not just about punishing the perpetrators.
Yeah.
It's about addressing the needs of the survivors, creating a system that balances punishment with restorative measures.
So it's this balance between holding people accountable for their actions while also creating a path for healing and reconciliation.
Right. And in the case of Rwanda, they had to deal with a massive number of perpetrators, so they revived these traditional community courts called gacaca.
Weren't there some concerns about those courts potentially re-traumatizing survivors by having to recount their experiences, and confront their perpetrators?
Yeah, that's a valid concern.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Staub and his colleagues worked closely with community and national leaders to try to mitigate those risks and ensure that the process promoted healing alongside justice.
It sounds like a monumental task.
Oh, it was.
That wasn't all, though, right? Dr. Staub also talks about the importance of forgiveness in the reconciliation process, which seems incredibly difficult in the context of genocide.
It is, and Staub argues that forgiveness, while important, must be approached carefully.
Okay.
Forgiving without acknowledging the actions or making reparations can actually reinforce the power imbalance between victim and perpetrator.
So it's not just about saying, I forgive you and moving on.
No, not at all.
There has to be more to it.
Yeah, it's a nuanced process that requires genuine remorse
Right.
and a commitment to making amends.
Okay, forgiveness can't be forced or demanded.
Right.
It has to come from a place of genuine healing and understanding, and even then it's a deeply personal choice, not an obligation.
Absolutely. It's about creating a space where forgiveness becomes possible.
Right.
Not forcing it upon people who may not be ready
Yeah.
or willing to offer it.
This has been really insightful so far.
Good.
But before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I'm curious about one more thing. The role of intergroup contact in bridging divides.
Okay.
Thinking about the contact hypothesis in psychology,
Yeah,
the idea that positive interactions between groups can reduce prejudice.
you're spot on.
How does that fit into all of this?
Well, Staub builds on that idea,
Okay.
and he emphasizes that contact has to happen under the right conditions
Okay.
to be effective.
What does that mean?
Well, it's not about just throwing people from different groups together and hoping for the best.
Yeah.
Right.
Research suggests that shared goals, equal status between the groups, and support from authority figures can all contribute to creating those kinds of positive interactions that foster understanding and empathy.
So things like dialogue groups, problem-solving workshops, community rebuilding efforts, where people from different sides come together to work towards a common goal.
Exactly. When people from different groups collaborate on a shared project,
Yeah.
they start to see each other as individuals
Right.
with shared hopes and dreams, not just members of, a hated enemy group.
They discover their shared humanity.
Yeah.
This makes me think about something else Dr. Staub mentioned in the article. Reconciliation being a long-term process, not a quick fix, and it requires a deep commitment from all levels of society.
That's a crucial point, yeah.
Yeah.
Reconciliation isn't something you achieve overnight. It's an ongoing journey that requires sustained effort
Right.
from individuals, communities, and institutions.
And it's a journey that requires us to understand not just the symptoms of violence, but also those deep psychological and social roots that make it possible.
Exactly.
This has been an incredibly eye-opening discussion so far.
Good, I'm glad.
We've covered a lot of ground, from the psychological scars of mass violence to the importance of understanding the root causes of conflict and the role of forgiveness, but we're just getting started.
Oh, we've only scratched the surface.
Right.
There's so much more to explore in Staub's work, and in the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into his specific interventions in Rwanda and how he applied these principles in a real-world setting, so stay tuned.
Awesome. Looking forward to it.
One thing that's really interesting is how Staub emphasizes not just these top-down approaches like truth commissions,
Okay.
but also these like bottom-up initiatives.
What do you mean by bottom up?
Think community-level interventions.
Yeah.
So, we talked about those small group discussions earlier.
Yeah.
But there's also these training programs for community facilitators to really become these like agents of healing and reconciliation.
So it's empowering people at the grassroots level.
Exactly.
To sort of take ownership of the process.
Yeah, and it all ties back to understanding the origins of violence.
Okay.
Something we were talking about earlier.
Right.
For survivors,
Yeah.
grappling with the perpetrator's humanity can be just incredibly tough.
I can imagine.
They're seen as these monsters.
Right.
But Staub suggests that understanding how seemingly ordinary people
Right.
become capable of such horrific acts can actually be healing.
Okay.
It's not about condoning it,
Right.
but contextualizing it,
Yeah.
making sense of the senseless.
So instead of just labeling these perpetrators as evil, you're trying to understand the psychological and social forces that contributed to their actions.
Exactly.
How does that work in practice?
So Staub actually held these workshops in Rwanda,
Okay.
where he presented this framework
Yeah.
for understanding the origins of genocide. He drew on examples from across history,
Okay.
and then he asked participants to apply this framework to their own experiences.
I'm curious how people responded to that.
Yeah.
Did they resist that?
Surprisingly, no. There was a real receptiveness to it.
Really?
It was as if this understanding,
Yeah.
even if it didn't excuse the violence,
Right.
made it feel less like a personal attack on their very being.
It's like by understanding it,
Yeah,
they could reclaim some sense of agency.
exactly.
Yeah.
Some control over their own narrative.
And this understanding wasn't limited to survivors, right?
No, it helped ease the defensiveness of some Hutu participants as well.
Really?
And it opened up a space for dialogue.
That's powerful.
It is. And remember, this understanding of the origins of violence isn't just about healing the past.
Right.
It's about preventing future violence,
Right.
recognizing the warning signs, addressing the underlying causes.
Yeah, it's all connected.
It's all connected.
This makes me think about how many atrocities we could prevent if we just had a better understanding
Absolutely.
of these forces that drive them. But then how do you go about spreading that understanding?
Right.
It can't just be confined to academic circles or small group discussions.
Absolutely. And, Staub and his team, they got creative.
Okay.
They developed radio programs
Oh, wow.
for a wider Rwandan audience,
Okay.
incorporating those same principles of healing,
Okay.
reconciliation, understanding the roots of violence.
So using the power of media
Yeah?
to reach a larger audience and promote this kind of positive social change,
Right.
did it work?
Well, early research is encouraging.
Okay.
People report increased knowledge about the causes of violence,
Okay.
more empathy for both survivors and perpetrators,
Wow.
and a greater willingness to actually engage in reconciliation efforts.
That's incredible. It shows that even in the aftermath of something as horrific as genocide,
Right.
there's still this hope for healing and positive change.
There is, and that brings us to another crucial point
Okay.
that Staub makes about the role of societal changes in achieving lasting reconciliation.
Okay.
So, we've talked about individual healing and understanding,
Right.
but structural and institutional changes are also vital.
Like what? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure. Think about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions.
Okay.
They establish an official record of the atrocities,
Yeah.
they provide a platform for victims,
Right.
and they offer a path for perpetrators to acknowledge their crimes and seek forgiveness.
Like South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while there are debates about their effectiveness, they can play a significant role in promoting truth, justice, and accountability.
What other societal changes do we need for this kind of genuine reconciliation?
Well, Staub highlights the need for a justice system that balances punishment with restorative measures.
Okay.
So holding perpetrators accountable while also addressing survivors' needs and promoting healing.
So it's not just about retribution,
No.
but creating a system that acknowledges the harm done
Right.
and works towards repairing that, fractured social fabric.
Exactly.
And specifically in Rwanda, with the huge number of perpetrators,
Yeah,
they had to get creative.
they did.
So they revived gacaca, those traditional community courts.
Right.
And they were designed to be more accessible and less formal than traditional courts, right?
That's right. And they aim to promote community involvement in the reconciliation process.
But didn't they also raise concerns about re-traumatization?
There's always a risk,
Yeah.
when you're dealing with such sensitive issues.
Right.
But Staub believes that the gacaca court's potential benefits
Okay.
in promoting truth, justice, and healing
Yeah.
outweighed the risks.
It sounds like navigating those complexities must have been a real challenge.
Oh, it was a huge challenge. And another sensitive aspect of reconciliation that Staub diagnoses is forgiveness.
Right. Such a loaded word,
It is.
especially in the context of genocide.
It really is.
How do you even begin to talk about forgiveness when such horrific acts have been committed?
Well, Staub emphasizes that forgiveness, while powerful,
Yeah.
must be approached carefully.
Okay.
Forgiving without acknowledging the actions or making reparations
Right.
can actually reinforce the power imbalance between victim and perpetrator.
So it's not just about saying, I forgive you and moving on.
No, it's a nuanced process
Okay.
that requires genuine remorse
Yeah.
and a commitment to making amends.
Forgiveness cannot be coerced or demanded.
Exactly.
It has to come from a place of genuine healing and understanding.
It does.
And even then, it's a deeply personal choice.
It is. There's no right or wrong answer.
Yeah.
There's no timeline. It's about creating the conditions
Okay.
where forgiveness becomes possible, not forcing it.
Right. And speaking of understanding,
Yeah.
we also need to talk about the role of intergroup contact in bridging these divides.
Right, like that contact hypothesis we talked about earlier.
Exactly. How do we put that into practice?
So Staub stresses that the contact needs to be structured
Okay.
in a way that promotes positive interactions.
Okay.
Throwing people together randomly
Right.
won't magically erase prejudice.
So what are the key ingredients then for effective intergroup contact?
Well, shared goals, equal status between the groups, and support from authority figures.
Okay.
All of these elements
Yeah.
create the conditions for genuine understanding and empathy to develop.
So things like dialogue groups,
Yeah,
joint problem-solving workshops,
right.
community rebuilding efforts. These can be incredibly powerful tools for reconciliation.
Exactly. When people from different groups work side by side
Yeah.
towards a common goal,
Right.
they begin to see each other as individuals,
Right.
not just as representatives of, a hated enemy.
Yeah.
They discover their shared humanity.
This brings us back to Dr. Staub's point about reconciliation being a long-term process,
It is.
not a quick fix.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Right. And it requires a sustained effort at multiple levels: individual, community, and societal.
Absolutely.
And it demands this commitment to understanding not just the symptoms of violence,
Right.
but its deep psychological and social roots.
Exactly.
This has been a really insightful conversation.
Good. I'm glad.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Right.
I want to touch upon one more aspect of Dr. Staub's work that I found fascinating.
Okay.
And that's the role of culture in both the likelihood of violence
Mhm.
and the prospects for reconciliation.
That's a great point.
Yeah, it's something we haven't fully explored yet.
Yeah.
And it seems like a critical piece of this whole puzzle.
Yeah, it is.
So let's dive into that in the next part.
Okay.
We'll explore how cultural values and norms can either contribute to these cycles of violence,
Right.
or conversely, foster this climate of peace and reconciliation.
Looking forward to it.
Awesome, stay tuned. Okay, so we were talking about how important culture is, to understanding both violence and reconciliation.
It is. Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, it seems like such a big topic.
Right.
Where do we even begin?
Well, think about it this way. Culture shapes our values, our beliefs, our norms.
Right.
They can fuel cycles of violence.
Yes.
Or they can act as a force for peace.
Okay, so let's say a society has a long history of, devaluing a particular group,
Right.
portraying them as dangerous or inferior or something like that.
Uh-huh.
How does that contribute to the likelihood of violence?
Well, that existing narrative,
Yeah.
makes it much easier to justify discrimination and violence against that group.
Right.
It's almost like,
Like it's setting the stage.
setting the stage. Yeah, self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. Are there any other cultural factors that sort of contribute to this?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Well, think about cultural norms around obedience to authority.
Okay.
If people are raised to just blindly follow orders,
Right.
they might be less likely to question or resist commands,
Okay.
even if they involve harming others.
That reminds me of the Milgram experiment, where people were willing to administer these electric shocks
Right.
just because an authority figure told them to.
Exactly, yeah.
It's a chilling example of how easy it is for us to be influenced by authority.
It really is.
So if certain cultural values can contribute to violence,
Yeah.
can other values act as a buffer, promoting peace and understanding?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So what are those?
Staub talks about, fostering a culture of pluralism,
Okay.
where different perspectives, different beliefs, they're valued and respected.
Yeah.
That kind of environment
Yeah.
makes it much harder for dehumanization to take hold.
It's like creating a society where people are encouraged to see the world through multiple lenses,
Right?
to understand and empathize with those who are different from them.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you cultivate that kind of culture, though?
Right.
Especially in a place that's been so torn apart by violence.
It's tough.
Yeah.
But it starts with education, teaching children.
From a young age, about empathy,
Right.
tolerance,
Right.
conflict resolution, the dangers of prejudice.
It's about giving them the tools to build a better world.
Yeah, exactly.
But it can't just be formal education in schools, right?
No, not at all.
Who else needs to be involved?
Parents, community leaders, religious institutions, the media,
Wow. Yeah.
they all play a role
Everyone.
in shaping cultural values and norms.
It takes a village.
It does. It's a collective effort, just like reconciliation itself.
Dr. Staub actually provides an example of how this can be done,
Right.
even in the most challenging of circumstances.
Yeah.
He describes how his team worked with community and national leaders in Rwanda to promote a more nuanced understanding of the conflict.
Right. They challenged those existing narratives
Right.
that just perpetuated hatred and division.
So they created these safe spaces for dialogue,
Yeah.
encouraged people to share their stories and listen to the stories of others.
Right.
And it's about recognizing that even the most horrific conflicts
Are rarely just black and white.
Exactly.
There are shades of gray. There are these complexities
Right.
that we need to grapple with if we really want to heal and reconcile.
Exactly. And, Staub's work,
Yeah.
both in Rwanda and beyond, really highlights
Yeah.
this human capacity
Right.
for change and growth.
Even in the face of unimaginable suffering.
Yeah, exactly.
It's amazing.
It is.
It's a testament to the power of hope
It is.
and this belief in a better future.
It really is.
Well, this has been such a powerful and insightful journey exploring Dr. Staub's work with you today.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
What are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that reconciliation, while it's a long and difficult process,
Yeah.
it is possible.
Yeah.
It requires a multifaceted approach,
Okay.
addressing both individual and societal wounds.
Right.
So we need to focus on healing trauma, understanding the root causes of violence.
Fostering empathy and forgiveness, and creating a culture that values peace and pluralism.
That's beautifully said.
Thank you.
It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times,
Yeah,
the human spirit can prevail.
it can.
We can choose to break those cycles of violence
Yeah.
and build a more just and compassionate world.
And it starts with each one of us.
Yeah.
By understanding these complex dynamics, by engaging in our own communities,
Right.
by advocating for policies that promote peace and understanding,
Yeah.
we can all contribute to this vital effort.
Well, this deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking,
Yeah.
and we hope it's given you, our listener, a deeper understanding of the challenges and possibilities of reconciliation.
Yeah.
Dr. Staub's work offers us a roadmap,
Exactly.
a beacon of hope,
A glimmer of light.
reminding us that even after the most horrific acts of violence, healing and reconciliation are within our reach.
They are, yeah.
Thanks for joining us on this journey.